Hi, everyone, and we welcome you this evening. Athena and I, as the co-founders of the Sisterhood of Salam Shalom, are so excited to be here with Integrity First for America and Amy, who hopefully many of you recognize from the incredible program we did with many of our partners in the field on May 18th. And it was because of the feedback that we had from so many of you to say, this is fascinating. This makes me feel like something is happening to control hate. This makes me feel like I'm empowered to have a role in controlling hate. Can we learn more? That Amy graciously agreed to join us. So what we're going to do this evening is Athea and I will ask some questions of Amy based on what we heard from many of you. And Amy, we invite you to respond to the questions. There will be an opportunity for questions to be asked. You could either use Q&A or your chat. And our facilitators, who you cannot see, but who are also on, will be sending the questions to me and to Athea. So let me just start, Amy, with a welcome. And really, the sisterhood is all about getting to know each other. And once we know each other, we feel like we care about each other, the ignorance is gone. And that's how we move through a whole cycle of getting rid of hate. And the way we get to know each other is by sharing stories. So Athea and I shared with you our story of the sisterhood, which started on the way to a trip to Auschwitz, where there were some very hateful things said to us. And that's really what triggered the sisterhood. And it should be noted that what you're working on is to stop the same type of hate that created Auschwitz. It should be noted that you've got some interesting background regarding that. And we shared with you how we started the sisterhood. Can we just start off for a few minutes with you sharing with the sisterhood how you started this and got involved in this?
Sure. So my background is in government and politics. I spent most of my career working in that world, which can feel so different than this world in certain ways. And in many ways, they're one and the same. And I like to think that what we're doing now is something the government might do in a different era of the United States, maybe not that long ago and hopefully not that far away. But for me, I've always, I'm the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, which has motivated and really colored so much of my own understanding of hate and how it works. But like many grandchildren or survivors, it was this far off thing that felt like we could learn from, we needed to understand, we needed to remember, but seemed impossible to conceive it ever happening here in any way, or even that the same forms of hate could truly become prevalent again, which is not to compare the moment we're in to the 30s or the 40s, but to acknowledge that we are very frighteningly at a moment where those same forms of hate are rearing their ugly heads and becoming increasingly prevalent in our public discourse, on our streets, in our communities. And so for a very long time, it felt like this far off thing that, I would bring my grandmother to elementary school show and tell, and we would tell her story and we would remember, but it didn't seem like something that would ever require the type of work IFA is doing right now. And I think if you had asked me when I was a kid, if you had asked my grandparents, if you had asked my mom, if their granddaughter or daughter would have to sue Nazis in 2020 as a means of trying to fight back against the rising tide of hate, we all probably would have thought you were crazy. Maybe not my grandparents, because they saw how it happened the first time. And so for me, when I remember vividly, probably like many of you, where I was when I first learned of what happened in Charlottesville. I was actually throwing my sister's bridal shower. I was with my family. I was working in the New York Attorney General's office at the time as the communications director and policy advisor. And I remember coming back to my phone after putting it down for the first time in a long time, and having a bunch of missed calls from my colleagues saying, a Nazi drove his car into counter protesters in Charlottesville. And I remember this sort of, we'd already seen the images from the night before. I don't think anyone thought that what was going to happen there was going to be positive. But I think we all hoped that we could at least avoid some of the horror that it ultimately became. And so I remember my stomach dropping, my heart dropping in the way that probably so many of us do when we learned of what happened and of Heather Heyer's death. And then, followed as there was some action in the aftermath of Charlottesville, but not very much. The government had, prosecuted James Fields, who drove the car. They took some action against some of the individuals for various assault charges. There was not a lot of action. And I was in the New York Attorney General's office at the time and got a call from Roberta Kaplan, who was saying, "I'm suing Nazis. Do you think you would be interested in helping?" It's a very hard thing to say no to. And so in the aftermath of what had happened, Robbie, working in collaboration with IFA, which was really just essentially an idea at that point, and some initial board members who had realized that there would be a need for private plaintiffs to take action on civil rights, given the vacuum with the federal government. The case came together very quickly, and I, again, when you get a call that says, "Do you want to help me sue Nazis?" it's very hard to say no. So ultimately, at the end of my time in the New York AG's office, I stayed through the end of Barbara Underwood's tenure there. She was the first woman New York Attorney General. And then I came over to work with our legal team and to work with IFA as the executive director to ensure this case was seen to fruition, that our plaintiffs, our legal team were safe and had every resource they needed to win, and to use this case as sort of a clarion call for the broader fight against white supremacy and other forms of hate, because as we saw clearly, Charlottesville was not an isolated incident, but rather a flashpoint in the rise of white supremacist violence in America. And you can't look at the cycle of violence over the last few years without seeing just how emboldened and how central Charlottesville was, emboldened the neo-Nazis were who were in Charlottesville, and how central that weekend was to the fight, or rather to their supposed fight. And so, I'm honored to do this work. I wish we didn't have to do this work, much like I suspect the two of you feel the same way about the work that you're doing. But if someone has to do it, I feel very lucky to get to do it. And I do think that, like I said earlier, if I had been asked when I was a kid, if I was a teenager, even in my 20s, if this was something we would have to do, I probably would have thought you were crazy. But now it sadly feels very necessary and very real.
Thank you. I want to ask a general question that you just touched on, and then I'm going to turn it over to Athea, who is an attorney, is a lawyer, to ask more legal focused questions, and we'll go back and forth. But you definitely touched on this, and we are seeing hate attacks against Jews, Muslims, anyone who's otherized at all-time highs. And it's been our understanding that what happened that the day before and that evening is not isolated, like you said, and that's really setting the stage for the hate that we're seeing now. And so what I'm wondering is, given everything that's happening now with the hate, is this one huge movement? Are they all communicating with one another? Is it all spreading to one another? Can you help us to understand
these connections
and the connection of what happened then and where we're at today?
It's a great question. And I think, the way that this movement operates, and I do call it a movement because while there are factions within it, while there are slightly varying ideologies among some of them, they all share that same hate and are motivated by the same hate that Cheryl just described. They hate all of us, probably every single one of us who are on this call, whether it's for our race, our religion, our willingness to defend others' rights,
maybe gender,
our gender, exactly. And there's so much to say about the deep connection between misogyny and white supremacy. And, the list goes on. And so while, it's funny, we'll talk about this in a moment, I'm sure, but one of the central statutes we're using in our case is something called the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871. It was created nearly 150 years ago to take on Klan vigilante violence in the South that targeted recently freed slaves. And I bring this up because for me, there's not much of a difference between the types of Klansmen that this law targeted, who would put on white hoods and meet in the woods somewhere and conspire and then attack recently freed slaves, and in more recent years, freedom fighters and others who would defend the Black community. And the white supremacists we see now, I don't see a huge difference there. The major differences are really the fact that they're so emboldened that they no longer wear white hoods and meet in the woods, and have the internet to find one another, connect, and perpetuate their cycle of hate. And so rather than having this hate isolated to specific pockets of the country where they were able to get together, it's now national and global in a way that it never could have been a few decades back. And so the role of social media and of the internet more broadly is critical to understanding how this movement operates. In some cases, there are groups, and our lawsuit takes on about a dozen groups in addition to a dozen or so individuals. And those groups operate the same way that hate groups have operated for years, except they are now using the internet. They are now meeting in ways that are different. And they have a reach that's larger than some of their predecessors. There are quite literally KKK groups that are defendants in our suit, but there's also groups like the National Socialist Movement and Vanguard America, groups that spread their propaganda both online and then offline. But there's also individuals, and some of these individuals are affiliated with these groups in leadership roles or otherwise. And some of them are just, for example, like Richard Spencer, who coined the term alt-right and is perhaps one of America's most famous neo-Nazis. He has his own organizational affiliations, but those groups were not necessarily involved in Charlottesville in the same way, and therefore they're not defendants, but Spencer was. And the ability of these individuals to sort of spur their loyal followers to action is really important to understand. And I'll just give a little bit of context to really give you, to help you understand how they work. We know firsthand what happened in Charlottesville. For months in advance on these social media platforms, these individuals and groups and their followers plan the violence in meticulous detail, down to what to wear, what to bring for lunch, which weapons to carry, and whether
Amy, if I could just interrupt, can you talk about how you gathered this information?
Yes, good. We know this. We know how they plan this violence in advance, because within a few days of the violence in Charlottesville, a nonprofit journalistic outfit called Unicorn Riot, and I would definitely recommend checking them out. They're doing some fantastic work around the protests right now, released into the world Discord chats. Discord is a social media platform popular among video gamers. They typically use it to communicate while they're playing a game. But in this case, it was co-opted by many of our defendants and their supporters, in which they had a series of channels on this site where they talked about everything I just listed: what to wear, what to bring for lunch, the mundane and banal. So will mayo spoil in the sun? What sort of gluten-free bread should we bring? The banality of evil is quite real. To exactly what unfolded, how they would crack commie skulls, quote unquote, and whether they could hit protesters with cars and then claim self-defense, which is, of course, precisely what happened.
What?
And so understanding the role of social media in allowing them to meet online, plan this out, and then in person go to Charlottesville and orchestrate this violence in ways that had, frankly, never been seen before. We had not seen an event like Charlottesville in my lifetime, or at least one that had that level of attention and scope and certainly tragedy. It's also important understanding, though, how the cycle of white supremacist violence that followed happened. So it didn't end there. We know that, for example, the Pittsburgh shooter who killed 11 Jews praying in synagogue on Shabbat a year and a half ago communicated on Gab, which is another social media site, with some of the Charlottesville leaders just before his attack. We know that the Christchurch shooter who killed dozens of Muslims praying in mosque a little over a year ago in New Zealand painted onto his gun a symbol that was first popularized by one of our defendants named Matthew Heimbach, who has been deeply involved in the global white supremacist movement. And that same symbol was found at the Highlander Center arson attack here in the States about a year ago. We know as well that Christchurch inspired the Poway shooter who killed one Jew praying in synagogue on the last day of Passover last year, and the El Paso shooting in which a white supremacist drove 10 hours out of his way to target a Walmart that was predominantly frequented by Mexican Americans and other members of the Latino community. And so on we see how this cycle works, which is that each attack is used to inspire the next one, often on these social media sites where they're either live streamed, like in the case of Christchurch, or these leaders and groups celebrate it, and the next disaffected white nationalist is looking on and thinks that he too can make a name for himself by undertaking some sort of violent act.
You know,
And
it's fascinating. You talk about like, so the, the social media influence of getting the word out and having a virtual community, which white supremacist groups are using as their tool. But on the other hand, because they're doing that, there is a record.
Exactly.
And it's fascinating to see how the tool of social media is being used.
Yeah.
And they don't care about the record.
No.
And in some cases they do, right? So these Discord chats were secret. And this opens up a whole other can of worms when it comes to what is the platform's responsibility in a certain
Right.
That was one of our next questions for you.
But in Charlottesville, for example, they were very explicit. They said, don't buy your tiki torches all at the same place. Make sure you're all going to different places so no one gets suspicious. They wanted that tiki torch attack on the University of Virginia to be a surprise. They used torches because they were evocative of the Nazis and the KKK, of course. And so in some cases, they know how to handle this in a way that will keep things quiet until they're ready. But as we all saw, they all marched in Charlottesville with their faces and their names right out there. And they're quite emboldened. And in many cases, very proud of what happened. And in the case of our student, this is all detailed in our lawsuit and is worth reading. They celebrated it after the fact.
Right.
First stop Charlottesville, next stop Auschwitz. They to bring it right back to what we were talking about at the beginning. And it's almost stunning how flagrant it is in certain ways.
Yeah, and I would encourage anyone who's listening right now to visit the website Integrity First America, and all the documents are there, news articles, legal documents, to really, if you want to get a deeper dive.
And I think someone from our team can also put that link in the chat so that everyone has it. We'll also be sure to send it out after the fact, so folks don't have to scroll now.
That's great. Athea, do you want to ask one of your
Yeah, as Cheryl said, I'm coming from a legal background. I'm a former Deputy Attorney General, actually from New Jersey, from your neighboring state. So I have just a keen interest in the legal side of this. And I was wondering if you could talk about really how unique this case is. This is a civil action. It's in federal district court. The fact that a motion to dismiss has been won by the plaintiff. Like, if you could just talk about the uniqueness of this case.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a fascinating question because in many ways, I mentioned earlier, we're using a statute that's nearly 150 years old.
Right.
And so in many ways, this isn't a new idea to take on, to allow private plaintiffs to take on those responsible for, in this case, a racist, violent conspiracy to undermine their rights. And that's really what the KKK Act is about. And there have been a number of cases since the KKK Act was first passed 150 years ago, including something called Griffin v. Breckinridge, which provides a lot of important precedent here. But at the same time, as we've talked about for the last few minutes, what happened in Charlottesville was unique. And this law was created long before the internet or social media existed, long before there were chat rooms in which they could plan the violence in such horrific detail. And so the case is unique in so many different ways. First, just the evidence that we have, I think, is really both incredible and striking, and certainly unheard of in a case that takes on the central leadership of a movement in the way that this does. And to that point, this is also really the only legal effort in this country right now to go after the central broad leadership of the white supremacist and white nationalist movement. have been individual cases against defendants like Andrew Anglin for his attacks on the Muslim community and on Jewish Americans.
Mhm.
Those have been successful in many ways, but there's not a case that truly goes after the broad leadership of this movement, both the individuals and the groups, with the potential to bankrupt and dismantle them like this one does.
Right, and it's a civil action, meaning it's not the government who's bringing this action, which they could do.
At a different time, they might, you know.
So, I think that's amazing, actually.
And I think also, you'll know this as a attorney, and for non-attorneys on the call, it's very unheard of also to have the level of sanctions and penalties.
Yes,
We've seen in this case. And again, it's the fact that we're dealing with neo-Nazi defendants who, as some of our lawyers like to describe, are like evil 12-year-olds. And that's how they act. And so, in most civil cases, the defendants comply with the basic court orders and understand that there's a rule of law that governs how
respect that rule of law.
You respect it even if you disagree with it, right? Mm-hmm. In this case, we have defendants who have so flagrantly violated court orders. One was thrown in jail earlier this year. Others were sanctioned over $41,000. Some have actually just not shown up for their scheduled depositions. So, which just happened last week, we asked the court to issue a bench warrant for the arrest of that defendant. It's actually the same one who was thrown in jail earlier this year for not adhering to the court orders that had already been issued. Mm-hmm. So it's certainly unique in that sense, in that most civil litigation doesn't involve defendants who don't really care for the rule of law and the court. The other way in which it's unique, because of who the defendants are, is that it requires resources that don't exist in most civil cases. It's right. A case that the security that we need to provide to our plaintiffs, our legal team, and the IFA team is unlike probably almost any other civil case in the country.
And that's frightening. Like that's frightening,
It's frightening, and it also speaks to, I think the silver lining there is it's important and it's frightening because of the impact this case can have. And it wouldn't be such a scary prospect. The security issue wouldn't be so real if we weren't really taking on those at the center of this movement. And we're already seeing the impacts. Just the other week, Richard Spencer complained in court that the case is, quote, financially crippling. Mm-hmm. Some defendants have said that
that's a new defense.
Exactly.
Yeah, I was going to say.
I'm not too sad about that one.
Yeah.
Some have said that they can't open a new headquarters because of our case. Others have tried to rebrand because they think the lawsuit is bad PR for their white nationalist propaganda. Of course, we're holding them accountable regardless. A few defendants have claimed that they're leaving the white supremacist movement. There's deep skepticism about that among experts. The SPLC had a great piece on that a few months ago, I believe in May, on the two defendants, Jeff Scoop and Matthew Heimbach, who all of a sudden, after being sued and sanctioned by the court, are starting to say, we don't actually believe this thing we've promoted for decades.
Yeah, we've seen the light all of a sudden.
Exactly. And so, I'm all for reform, but it has to be genuine. And we believe the best way to prove that you're reformed is to fully comply with the court orders in our case, which neither of them have done. And so it is unique in so many ways. The list goes on, but I think that gives you a sense of just how striking, as you put it, so much of this is.
Yeah, and I just wanted you to talk about that just so our listeners can really understand the magnitude of what the effect of this lawsuit could be.
So, tied in with what you just said, for our listeners to understand, the reason we did a webinar this evening, and through you all, as opposed through the sisterhood and allowing for Zoom meetings and all, is for security.
Yep.
So I hope everyone understands and appreciates that. So Amy, one of the things that we were trying to understand is, where is all their funding coming from?
Yeah.
And what can we do to impact on that funding that's channeling to them?
It's a great question. There's a lot to say there too, as there is in so many of these elements. First, it's very clear that what happened in Charlottesville had real financial weight behind it. They didn't all show up wearing matching outfits and carrying matching tiki torches, driving matching white vans without some sort of money behind them. And we think our case is the best opportunity to get to the bottom of that. And we are currently in the middle of what's called discovery, which is the evidence collection portion of the case. That means we're deposing these Nazis and have a variety of other information and evidence that we've been collecting, including quite literally scraping it off of their phones, computers, social media, and email accounts as a result of those court orders I mentioned earlier that our team won. And that they're finally being forced to comply with as a result of some of these sanctions. And so we think in terms of broader buckets of money that this case provides a good opportunity to understand who might be funding things. But we also know that for many of these individuals and groups, they were able to function and even flourish on sites that we all know and use for years.
Like?
And for a very long time, they were on sites like PayPal and others. And thankfully, in recent years, they've been deplatformed from these sites. Some of them are saying, I can't even get, just mail me cash in an envelope because that's all I could take at this point. That's quite what one of our defendants, I believe Chris Cantwell might have said. He's actually coincidentally now in jail for other threats he made, to give you a sense of how wonderful these individuals are. And so, and I mentioned earlier, rather, that Richard Spencer complained in court that this case was financially crippling. He then went on to say it is financially crippling because he also can't raise money because he's been deplatformed from social media, where he had been raising money and promoting his hate for so long. And so
I'm just shocked. How could that even be a defense? I just can't even believe how emboldened these defendants are to say something like that.
Well, he was saying
for my hate group. Sorry, not even a sorry, just.
And he was saying this in a hearing over his own lawyer's motion to withdraw, which the court granted because Spencer was not paying him and not cooperating or communicating with him. And he is not the first lawyer to withdraw from representing these guys. So, there is a lot to say there, but I do think one of the biggest takeaways for people is that deplatforming works. If you look at the track record here, if you look at the payment sites, the social media sites that have actually had the courage of their convictions to do something about this and kick these extremists off their platforms in a real substantive way, it significantly hinders their ability to operate. And no social media site, no payment processing site is under any First Amendment requirement to allow
it's private business. Yeah.
Exactly. And they, some, and as I'm sure many have seen the current debate happening around Facebook and the Stop Hate for Profit campaign, in which Facebook has essentially refused to do much about the hate that's been flourishing on its site. And a number of organizations, including a number of partners of ours, like the NAACP, the ABL, and others, have launched a campaign encouraging businesses to stop their advertising dollars for the month of July in an effort to push Facebook to do the right thing. Does not seem to be moving in that direction based on what came out of a meeting the other day, but money talks in both directions, as we saw, as Richard Spencer reminded us in court the other week. I think it's something that, as consumers of social media, we can also keep in mind, and there's an opportunity for us to use our voices on as well. And so if people want to take anything away from the whole Richard Spencer drama, it should be that deplatforming works, and we should keep that in mind as a tool and encourage all sites to use it.
Right, you're taking the microphone away.
Exactly.
Right.
Thea, before I turn it over to you, we were asked to ask you a question, Amy.
Yes, I don't know if you see it in the chat.
And about what the court orders are. Maybe you could clarify what you mean when you refer to court orders.
Of course. So there's been so much back and forth in terms of motions that are filed in our case that there's quite literally a webpage on our website that is quite long at this point. You'll see list after list after list of motion and decision and opposition to a motion, and it goes on and on. But in this case, there has been a few, I think, really key decisions from the court that are worth flagging. The first one, and I think, Althea, you mentioned
motion to dismiss.
Yes.
Okay.
I'm sorry. I'm losing my voice on top of it. So that motion to dismiss, which was filed by a number of the defendants in early 2018, was almost entirely rejected by the court in July of 2018. And that made clear that the case can move forward, that some of the defenses that the defendants tried to throw out there, including that the First Amendment protects them, don't apply here, that if we prove the facts as alleged in the complaint, there's a case here, there's, we would win. And so that decision is on our website. I would encourage folks to read it. You don't have to be a lawyer to sort of read it and understand just how, I think, sharply written it is by the court, and how important it is to understanding these issues, that the First Amendment does not protect someone's right to commit violence, for example. Mm-hmm. And so that was sort of the first major victory in this case. But since then, we've gone to the court and said the defendants under basic procedures in civil lawsuits like this are required to turn over discovery, turn over the evidence in the suit, their phones, their social media accounts where they plan this violence, their email accounts, their computers, their other devices. Many have refused to, and so we've gone to the court and filed what's called motions to compel, meaning that they need to, the court has to compel a defendant to hand this material over. In some cases, defendants eventually handed things over. In other cases, they did not. One claimed his phone fell in the toilet, for example. It's like the dog ate my homework of the neo-Nazi movement. Mm-hmm. And we've eventually filed what's called motions for sanctions, meaning that we are asking the court to financially and otherwise legally penalize the defendants for failure to comply with the original court orders that the court had issued requiring them to turn over this evidence. And so it has been a lot of back and forth, to put it lightly. When I say court orders, it simply means what the court has told the defendants to do, which has been extensive. Whether or not they've actually complied is part of the ongoing fight. And all of those decisions are on our website as well. And so I think it's, for any lawyers or non-lawyers who are interested in perusing them, would encourage you to give it a look.
Great. A question just came up from one of our participants. Is there a website that features the names of corporate entities that sponsor or promote hate so we could boycott and complain to those entities?
It's a good question. It's hard, right? Because in some cases, the sites and even researchers who track this thing won't know, what a neo-Nazi might be using at a certain point. So I think, for us, there are a number of entities we follow, and that I personally follow, that track these things. There's an organization called Sleeping Giants that has been tracking sort of corporate extremism as it relates to corporate work, sexism as it relates to corporate, and they are part of the same Stop Hate for Profit campaign. Similarly, the ADL, SPLC, and other organizations do work on this front, as do Color of Change does a great work on this front. They are also another partner in that Stop Hate for Profit campaign. So rather than sort of, figure out which organizations, or rather corporations and other companies to start with, I think it's helpful to sort of follow those who are tracking this, who can then call out instances of hate when they see it. And in some cases, there are good socially responsible corporations who will do the right thing and remove it from their platform and ban those users, or stop selling the merchandise, or whatever it might be. In other cases, you have those who, do the bare minimum and don't want to worry about losing the money they think they might make on this. And one frustrating example is that just a few weeks ago, a friend of mine texted me a link to an Amazon site, an Amazon page, where someone was selling a Trump 2020 mask that was designed to look like a swastika.
Yep.
And so this friend saw it, I don't know, and he texted it to me. I tweeted it. It sort of blew up, as did, I think, a few other who work in this space tweeted it. And by the morning, Amazon had taken it down. But the idea that, someone like me or any of the others who saw it and identified it and called it out should be the ones responsible for catching this, as opposed to the actual corporation that runs that website is frustrating, right? It shouldn't be on individual citizens to catch something after the fact. We should be catching it on the front end so it's never there to begin with. And so I think, the best thing to do is follow the organizations, whether it's IFA, but more so even organizations like Color of Change and Sleeping Giants, ADL, SPLC, and others that are tracking these things. And then you can sort of make educated decisions about what you're comfortable doing, and also call out companies and organizations when necessary. I think the Facebook campaign, just given how central Facebook is to how many Americans get their news, and the way it's been used not just to promote extremism, but to spread disinformation and other deeply, deeply horrific sort of tactics that have truly undermined our democracy in so many ways. I think the Facebook campaign is one of the most important ones happening right now, just by sheer reach of those, sheer reach if and when they actually do the right thing. The damage that has already been done is quite large. But Facebook is a reality of the world in which we live in, and the best thing we can do is use every tool we have to push them to do the right thing.
Right. So if I could go back and really talk about, because I guess we're kind of assuming that everyone has some level of knowledge about this case, but number one, why is it that average citizens, the plaintiffs, had to come forward and file this complaint? Where was the government? And second question related to that is, what is then the theory of the case? What is the legal theory by which these plaintiffs actually could bring this action? I think that's important for all of us to understand.
Yeah. So I think, if we were living in a different time and place, or at least a different time, well, I don't know if there would be a need for this case in a different time. Who knows if Charlottesville would have ever happened, or at least in the way that it did. But to say it did. This is a case that perhaps the Department of Justice, the Civil Rights Division would have brought. Unfortunately, we know now that DOJ civil rights investigations and prosecutions are down over 2/3 over the last few years.
Sure. Yeah.
This is the part of our government that was quite literally created to protect people's civil rights and take on cases exactly like the one that we're doing. And instead, they're focused on things like fighting affirmative action at Harvard. And so it was very clear in 2017 that there was going to be a vacuum here, that private plaintiffs and other individuals would have to step up. State AGs are another place where there has been a significant step up, and you know this from your work. In my prior life,
filling the void, really, right?
Exactly. And so in this case, there's not a lot of statutes and laws on the books that deal with private conduct as it relates to civil rights. So much of our civil rights laws deal with governmental conduct, what the government can and can't do when it comes to essentially discrimination and undermining people's rights. The KKK Act is one of the few that actually deals with private conduct and gives private citizens a right of recourse to hold accountable those who undermine their most basic civil rights, which is exactly what happened in Charlottesville. These individuals were there peacefully protesting, saying white supremacy doesn't belong in their community. And they were targeted based on their race, their religion, and their willingness to stand up for others. And can
you talk about who some of those plaintiffs are, Amy, just so that people.
Our plaintiffs are incredible. I think they are so amazing, because instead of sort of like curling up into a ball and throwing up their hands as so many might do after living through what they did, they've decided to not take the easy route, but take the long, hard route of fighting a civil case for years in the court to hold those accountable who were truly responsible for what happened. And so our plaintiffs are a variety of Charlottesville community members, 10 altogether, who were injured both during the Friday night Tiki Torch violence and then on Saturday throughout the day, including during the car attack. It includes some folks like Liz Sines, who's the Sines and Sines v. Kessler, which is the name of the lawsuit, was a UVA law student at the time. She and some of her classmates had been peacefully protesting at the Thomas Jefferson statue on campus during the Tiki Torch March. They were surrounded by these neo-Nazis, had fuel and lit torches thrown on them. One plaintiff, an African-American man, said he thought he was going to die that evening. There's a number of others who were injured throughout the violence during the day on Saturday, including Reverend Seth Wispoy, who had taken the lead in organizing an interfaith response to what was happening in his hometown. And that interfaith gathering had to shelter in place because it was unsafe to leave. And then the following day on Saturday, he had been marching peacefully with other interfaith clergy of all backgrounds, and they were charged by these white supremacists and neo-Nazis, and he was injured. And then, of course, we have our plaintiffs who were injured in the car attack. Many of you might know the iconic Pulitzer photo of the car going through the crowd. And in it, you can see a few of our plaintiffs, including Marcus Martin, who's the African-American man sort of splayed over the back of the car in a white shirt and red and white sneakers. He had just pushed his then fiance, now wife, Marissa, out of the way. Both were seriously injured. Both of them are plaintiffs. Natalie Romero, who there's another photo of sitting on the side of the road with blood dripping down her face. She suffered a number of injuries, including a cracked skull. When they talked about cracking skulls, it's stunning to me that they quite literally did. Thomas Baker, who's also seen in that Pulitzer photo, flipping over the hood of the car, wearing a gray t-shirt, and a number of others who were injured during that attack and the broader violence. And again,
have they had a consequence from filing this action? You talked about security. If you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, it's, you know, the threats against our plaintiffs, our legal team, and IFA itself are not small. They have been significant, you know, including some of our defendants saying things about all the fun they're going to have with us when this is over, quote unquote, to a number of their supporters tweeting like stuff right out of Nazi Germany in terms of caricatures and other forms of hate. You know, I'm a Jewish woman, and the two of the lead attorneys are also Jewish women, and that is not something that has escaped these defendants and their supporters. That is a core piece of the puzzle for them. They make that well known, you know, and we take security very seriously. A number of our plaintiffs have also gotten direct threats, some in person, some online. You know, one, like I said, is a reverend who is, at least in the before times, was giving sermons and running services on a weekly basis at his church. And so there are some concerning factors that we keep in mind here. And to be completely frank, the biggest line item in IFA's budget is our security budget, because it is the most important thing at the end of the day, protecting our plaintiffs, protecting our team. And it also is just a very real threat that we grapple with and deal with. And so, again, I think all of us feel lucky to get to do this work. Wish we didn't have to, but it means that we have an extra responsibility to keep everyone safe.
Yeah, it's a high price. You can see from some of the, I don't know if you can see, Amy, some of the questions.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or, you know, is this a jury trial? That's a question. What are the damages that are being requested? I know that, you know, damages, you can read the complaint, but if you can give a more succinct answer, easier to find.
So it is a jury trial, to start there. I do think that will be quite powerful. This is going to be a jury trial in Charlottesville, the courthouse. It's in federal court in the Western District of Virginia, and the courthouse is literally 2 blocks from Heather Heyer Way, where this all unfolded. And there's something particularly powerful about these individuals being put before a jury of their peers in the community that they terrorized, that they attacked, and being held accountable. And I think that's so important. And we think that the jury will see clearly what we know, which is that this was long planned in advance, it was intentional, and that they came to Charlottesville with the intention to harm people based on who they are, what they believed, what the color of their skin, or any of those other protected factors. And so it will be quite powerful. We think, you know, Robbie, one of our lead counsels, likes to say how every few years every decade or so, there's a trial that truly captures the nation's attention and is about more than the parties themselves, but is about a broader public reckoning with an issue. And she, you know, years ago represented Edie Windsor in the marriage equality case, in one of the first cases in the series that ultimately led to marriage equality. The Windsor case struck down the Defense of Marriage Act. At the same time, the Prop 8 litigation was happening in California, which really served as the sort of public trial that helped educate the public about the fight for marriage equality. And similarly, you can go back to Scope Spunky and sort of see the role that a trial can play in shaping the public consciousness on an issue. And we think particularly now as we're having this public reckoning on racism, on injustice in America, putting on the stand and laying out so clearly the violent hate that's at the center of this movement, and holding them accountable in court of law by a jury of their peers is going to be so important and so powerful on so many levels, not just for Charlottesville and for Virginia, but for the country as a whole. And so that's, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I would love for you to go on and on and on, and we need to learn so much. But given how much our sisters are craving the need to do something,
Action.
and they've all heard me say that I contacted Athea because I felt years ago when the two of us couldn't see what's happening today back then, but I felt that the late 30s and early 40s were breathing down our neck. And if Jews and Muslims, who were clear targets of this, didn't come together as one, we didn't have any chance for change. And it's clearly the late 30s and early 40s are breathing down our neck right now. One of the big differences, we have things like IFA. We have things like the Sisterhood, who represent about 8,000 foot soldiers who can get out there and rise and respond. And so, Amy, help us. I know one thing that we could all do, you've made it clear, funding is critical. Funding is critical to move forward. Funding is critical for security. People could go to your website. I encourage everyone to sign up to receive your emails and your updates. They're phenomenal, and donate. So that's the easiest for people to do, and it's desperately needed. What else can people do, which we did not see happen for the most part in the late 30s and in the 40s, to put an end to these Nazis' behavior?
Well, it's so funny you say it that way, because that's exactly how I talk about it as well. I talk about how my grandparents' generation did not have the tools we have to fight back. They didn't have the rule of law. They didn't have a justice system. They don't have communities like this one that could connect in this way and then go out and do something. So I'm really grateful to all of you, specifically the two of you, and to the broader community for being so passionate about actually doing something here and not just sort of like hearing the spiel and moving on. So thank you. There's so much that can be done. I'll give a few examples, but also this is not an issue that's going away quickly. And I think that it is one of the most serious threats to both our democracy and our national security. And until we start talking about it that way, we're not going to deal with it with the gravity it needs. And so before anything, understanding that white supremacist violence is a dire threat to our national security and to our democracy, and making that clear to your friends and your family and your elected officials is a clear starting point. There are very concrete pieces of legislation that are out there that would do some basic things you would assume already happened to close gaps in how we handle hate crimes and how we handle domestic terror and other forms of violence. There's something called the No Hate Act. It's actually named after Heather Heyer, among some other victims of hate crimes. Again, these are things that you would have expected to happen, like improved reporting of hate crimes so that law enforcement and the FBI can actually analyze trends and identify where there are issues happening. The lack of data on hate crimes is stunning. Like, it's so hard to actually understand who's being targeted and how they're being targeted and where, because there's just totally inconsistent data. And so the No Hate Act would start to fix some of that reporting. It would put in place more resources on various levels of government and give them the tools to actually identify and investigate and report on this and train them. It would obviously put financial resources behind some tools to fight back. And it would do a few other things as well that I think are sort of, again, the bare minimum to begin moving in the right direction here. So that's the No Hate Act. There's also something called the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act, which is sponsored by a variety of folks. I believe Dick Durbin in Illinois is the lead sponsor on the Senate side. And there are a whole host of others who support it. Similarly, it has not moved forward despite being reintroduced for a few years now. This would close a number of gaps that exist when it comes to the domestic terror threat. It would ensure that local, state, and federal officials are coordinated in ways that they aren't. It would require DOJ and DHS and the FBI to do some basic things when it comes to monitoring and investigating, analyzing, and of course, prosecuting domestic terror. It would require certain reporting structures to Congress. It would require a whole host of other resources being put into this issue that, again, I think many of us as Americans would assume our government was already doing when you look at the sheer horror of the white supremacist and other domestic terror threats we've faced in recent years. So again, the No Hate Act, the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act, I think are two great bills that would go a long way towards closing these gaps and start moving our public policy in the right direction.
And I just wanted to mention, Amy, that both Athea and I are on the board of the Muslim Jewish Advisory Council.
And they are big supporters
of this, yeah.
Yes.
And I believe the No Hate Act was the centerpiece of the event.
It was.
Met. And so while IFA is a 501c3, we don't do lobbying. I should specify that. I think
we get it.
we don't either. We're nonpartisan, non-lobby.
And everyone who is listening in their personal capacities can advocate for these bills. They are no-brainers from, I think, many people's perspectives. And it's just a sad testament to sort of how far behind on this issue we are, that they haven't moved forward in the first place. There's a lot more debate happening on this topic, and I think it's also worth educating yourself about some of issues. For example, the debate over whether we should have a domestic terrorism statute, where right now, I think if we had one, there would be some concerns about how this federal administration abuses it to go after, for example, Black Lives Matter. Based on some of the comments that this president and DOJ have made related to the current protests. And so I think there's also some debate that needs to happen about some of the ideas out there. That doesn't mean that we don't need to move something forward in some way. I think the fact that a white supremacist can't be prosecuted as a domestic terrorist is horrible. And, you know, there was one important step forward made a few months ago, I believe in April, when the State Department finally designated a white supremacist foreign organization as a foreign terror organization for the first time. This was a Russian group called the Russian Imperial Movement. Unsurprisingly, they have deep ties to some of our defendants because this is a very cyclical sort of community, as we talked about, and deeply integrated one. You see that cycle continue, not just nationally, but globally. But there's, you know, I think it's also worth understanding these issues, figuring out, you know, where you fall on some of these policy debates that might be coming down the pike, particularly if there are changes in Congress and in the White House, and understanding, you know, for example, there's a lot of smart people out there talking about how a domestic terror statute could be shaped in a way that protects people, protects our civil liberties and our civil rights, while also going after those actual domestic terrorists who are killing people in synagogues and Walmarts and mosques and Sikh temples and churches. And so on the legislation side, I think there's, again, those basic pieces of legislation that could pass and much larger conversations that are happening now. There's also the private sector side, and we touched about on this earlier. You know, no social media site is obligated to give a platform to these individuals or groups, and making your voice heard on that, whether it's through something like the Stop Hate for Profit campaign or another venue, is really powerful and really important. Similarly, if you see a site like Amazon selling something like that, call it out. Decide how you want to spend your dollars. I think that there is so much that we have the power to do as consumers on these sites, and if enough of us are making our voices heard, it has the potential to actually make a difference here, using our voices and using our dollars to make clear where our values should lie. And so, you know, it's a lot more amorphous than supporting a very specific piece of legislation. And it's a lot harder in a way because you have to do some of the legwork to understand which sites and which corporations are doing the right thing and the wrong thing. But as I mentioned earlier, there are a number of organizations tracking this. And I think that there's a lot that we as consumers can do, even if we are just an average person trying to make a difference and not, a company like Ben & Jerry's pulling our funding from Facebook. That helps too.
It does help too. Amy, could you also mention to everyone the importance of making people aware of this case?
Yes.
And what they could do to, from their part, which is very simple to do that.
Yeah, we think it's so critical that people know that this case exists. It's so easy to feel helpless and scared and angry right now. I know I feel that way every day, and I work on these issues, and I know what's happening. This is one of the few concrete, tangible things happening, taking on those at the center of the movement, holding them accountable, using our rule of law, using our justice system to fight back. And it provides a very concrete way to do something right now. So if everyone spent a few minutes sharing this on your social media, emailing something to your list, we actually have an activist toolkit on our website that we could put in the chat, and there's sample social media and email content there that you could quite literally copy and paste if it makes your life easy. Share it with your networks, follow us on social media, share it with your networks, and let them know that this is happening. If you sign up for case updates on our website, we'll be keeping folks apprised there of developments as we head to trial, and then of course during trial itself, which is also important. We also think it's critical to show the diversity of support for this case, because as we talked about earlier, they don't just hate one of us, they hate all of us, and our fates are so deeply intertwined here. And we didn't spend a lot of time talking about their ideology, but understanding just how central these various forms of hate are to how they operate and why they do what they do underscores how deeply our fates are so intertwined and how we can't fight for one of us and protect one of us without fighting for all of us.
Right.
And so, we all have so much at stake here. The Jewish community, the Muslim community, anyone who doesn't fit their narrow definition of what a white American looks like. And as I said earlier, I don't think anyone on this call would. We all have so much at stake here. And so by letting people know that this case is happening, there's a tangible, concrete way to fight back, that they could directly support it if they would like in a variety of ways, by spreading the word themselves, by donating to cover security and evidence collection costs if they are willing, and then by making their voice heard on the importance of this, especially as we work towards trial this fall. It is so critical and so important, showing our plaintiffs that there is a broad, diverse community that has their back, and showing the country that the vast majority of us don't believe that this sort of violent hate has any place here, no matter how much these far-right extremists try to insert it into our public discourse and make it the norm.
And it's really
my
pleasure at the Sisterhood to give that kind of amplification about what's going on.
Thank you. And we are so grateful for events like this that also really allow us to get it out there. So thank you to everyone again, to both of you.
Well, it's wonderful. And to all of you, please go to the chat. Allison has put up the links that will help you. And for those of you that aren't aware, Amy is, my guess is spending almost 24/6 on this, every day and evening speaking to a different group while running the organization and keeping up on everything else. So Amy, we're all desperate for hope, and you do give us that hope. So thank you. Consider us your partners, and whatever we could do to help you, we're here. And I know we'll continue these efforts with you. I thank all of you for being on and for being the foot soldiers out there to do what did not happen in the late 30s and in the 40s, to be the voice and the force of change. So Amy and team, thank you all. And we're here to help you do your job. So thank you.
Thank you all so much.
Bye-bye.